Muito bom dia a todos. Umas palavras em português, naturalmente, depois terei que falar em inglês, como devem compreender. É um gosto imenso vê-los aqui e vê-los participar, vê-las e vê-los participar nesta sessão em que vamos refletir um bocadinho sobre o futuro das universidades e da Universidade do Porto em particular. É um esforço que me parece que vai ser conseguido na medida do número de inscrições. Penso que daqui a um quarto de hora teremos bastante mais gente, mas é um número razoável de inscrições. Temos mais de 300 inscrições, temos 330 inscrições e, portanto, nós vamos começar, até porque, por razões associadas aos problemas de aviões, o professor Lopes da Silva vai ter que ir um bocadinho mais cedo, porque foi antecipado o voo e, portanto, não podemos estar a perder tempo. Well, dear Dean of the Faculty of Medicine, Professor Amélia Ferreira, I'm delighted to be here in one of these visiting rooms of the university. Dear keynote speakers, dear members of the Porto community, dear guests, allow me to be short with the protocol. Welcome to you all, namely to those who are from outside, to the University of Porto. We are in the Faculty of Medicine, which is one of the 15 visiting rooms of our university, a visiting room with a lot of history, since medicine started, let's put at higher education level, basically in 1825, but it is one of our 15 visiting rooms. It is a great pleasure, and of course it is a honor and be sure that these are not words of occasion, to receive you in this University of Porto Congress 2016. When I applied to this position of rector, which I held since 27th of July 2014, I made a commitment to bring the future of the university into the internal debate, with participation of invited third parties. This conference represents, to a large extent, part of the fulfillment of this commitment. The purpose of this initiative is to hold a debate on the very necessary search for the best academic policies and practices to adopt in our public mission. In a fast-paced and increasingly globalized world, and these are something like vérité de la police, of unsteady growth and pressing social and economic uncertainties, creating both unprecedented challenges and opportunities for science, technology, and higher education, the university carries an enormous responsibility. After all, and as so well dealt with by Professor Stefan Collini, one of our guest speakers, in his book published in 2012, we should keep trying to answer this simple question, but with complex answers. What are universities for? Let me leave you with a few reflections concerning this question. I see universities as centers of knowledge, culture, and research. I see universities as institutions with the mission of producing, developing, promoting, and transferring knowledge and culture. 28 years ago, on the 18th of September, 88, 388 university rectors of all Europe and beyond joined in Bologna by occasion of the 900th anniversary of, well, there's a discussion of what is the oldest university in Europe, apparently 10 years older than Oxford. And they have agreed on a document that states 4 fundamental underlying principles of the university mission. First, autonomy and diversity. Universities are autonomous institutions at the heart of societies differently organized. Research and teaching must be morally and intellectually independent of all political authority and economic power. Secondly, teaching and research should be seen and carried out as inseparable activities. Thirdly, freedom. This should be an unnegotiable value in research and training. Freedom in research and training is the fundamental principle of university life, and both governments and university governance models must ensure respect for this fundamental requirement. Finally, universities are trustees of European humanist traditions. It transcends geographical and political frontiers, we believe, and affirms the vital need for different cultures to know and influence each other. These are principles that are today recognized by more than 600 signing universities of the agreement, of the Magna Carta, of 77 countries around the world. These principles were reasserted last week in São Paulo, Brazil, by more than 130 rectors or representatives, by occasion of the commemorations of the 28th anniversary of the Magna Carta, yet with the clear vision of the need to adapt and reinterpret these principles at light of devolution, as, after all, universities always did. I believe that it is worth to remind ourselves of some aspects of today's life. First of all, the shout, the cry of UNESCO back in 1990 of education for all, proclaimed in Thailand in a meeting on that time. Secondly, the felt need for mass education, continuing education, requiring for that a strong effort of diversity of offer. Thirdly, what we call University 5.0 is already here. University without boundaries and without walls is here, which represents opportunities and threats. Pedagogical issues are at stake, namely for faculty training. Also, education and research in large scale, as it happens today, require massive budgets. And finally, because of this, there is a growing pressure for accountability to society, not only to governments. And what will be life in 20 years' time, in 2038, when the Magna Carta commemorates 50 years? What will be? We don't know. I don't know. Well, possibly University 10.0 will be here, not 5.0, 10.0, whatever. In a form that maybe we are not yet able to entirely foresee today. Targets for mass education. We should have all young people educated at higher education level. As an engineer, I say 95% of confidence interval. Let's put it this way. But 95%, 100% with education, with higher education. Diversity of offer, that's a major requirement in order to meet the motivation and the competencies of young people. And of course, diversity of offer of continuing education, again to meet the needs of individuals and society. Because we shall live longer, we shall have to work longer, we shall have to study longer. And then the ultimate thing, the need to adapt. We should keep in mind this idea that somehow comes from Darwin's vision. They say it was Darwin, but many people say this is not written by Darwin, but the idea is there. It is not the strongest of the species that survives, but rather that which is most adaptable to change. Indeed, I believe that we need to keep revisiting principles and interpret them at the light of evolution. Enlarging the dimension of the mission means growing budgets and related growing pressure for accountability, as I mentioned. Independence of political and economic power requires capacity for significant levels of self-financing, global competitiveness, more flexible forms of governance, getting as much as possible free from the bureaucracy that we basically all know exists. In all, the fundamental values of the Magna Carta remain as the pillars for the existence of universities: autonomy, education and research, freedom, rationalist, humanist values. Yet, we have to reanalyze them, to reanalyze the scope, the breadth and the depth, as indeed it has been done throughout the centuries. There is an urge and need for revisiting the meaning of serving humanity. What does it mean to serve humanity? Of serving society. What does it mean to serve the society? How do we serve the society? There is a need for sensible, rational equilibrium in finding and implementing new governance models, requiring views that as much as possible anticipate the future. Promoting pedagogical evolution, developing holistic views of society, capturing, of course, new sources of financing, coming closer to people. Ladies and gentlemen, this conference welcomes 11 prominent scholars from prestigious international universities and scientific institutions. It has the active participation of 23 faculty, 1 student, and 1 non-teaching staff representative. I am very pleased to say that we have more than 300 registered colleagues. I just hope that the debates meet expectations of us all, with so high quality of the keynote speakers, to whom I so much thank for your availability. I would say that it has all the ingredients to be useful, which means to be successful. Given the natural impossibility of covering all issues relevant to daily life and the future of universities, we will focus on 4 themes that we believe are fundamental for our development, which will be discussed in 7 plenary sessions, consisting of 10 talks given by guest speakers. Theme 1, today, holistic approach to defining the role of universities in the 21st century. Theme 2, inviting to reflect on the core elements of education and research in a changing world. Theme 3 will discuss the 3rd mission of universities, and of course, including not only knowledge transfer, but the creation of a vision for advancing culture and science for all. Theme 4 will address the challenges of university governance. In the closing session, which will immediately follow the last plenary session, we will also be joined by the Minister of Science, Technology and Higher Education, who will provide an important contextual report on the current challenges and opportunities for science, technology and higher education. It is my sincere hope that this event and the conclusions drawn from the ensuing debates will serve as an important contribution to the adaptation to the times the University of Porto must undertake in order to continue its mission of public service. This mission acts not only in favor of national progress, but also of advancing the fundamental knowledge, art and culture across all borders that will benefit the future of all humanity. I shall conclude by offering my wholehearted acknowledgement and thanks first and foremost to my colleagues, to the rectorial team, namely to Pedro Teixeira, to Fátima, to Maria João, that so much supported and were active in this organization. I would equally like to thank the directors of the faculties who promptly made their facilities available upon request, facilitated an extensive team of cultural events and communication experts, and made the faculty services available, which were paramount to the logistic and organization of this event. Last but not least, certainly it's my duty to acknowledge gladly the relevant sponsorship of FASEC and Montepio, 2 companies, institutions that we all so well know in Portugal, and that so swiftly answered my request of support. Of course, a most useful support, considering that there were no registration fees in this event. I thank you all very much for your participation. May these sessions about thinking the future prove to be fruitful. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Welcome to this conference organized by the University of Porto. This conference is supposed to reflect on the role of the university in these first years of the 21st century, in a time where changes are so quick and, let's say, so drastic. It is not easy for us, academics, who began their activity 30 or 40 years ago, to face this new world where everything becomes suddenly so different and so ephemeral. Our today's invited speaker is the right person in the right place. He is well known by his writings on the importance of the rising of a different concept of university, a concept that modifies some established ideas, some ways of thinking, the importance of not forgetting that universities are mainly places of intellectual, educational, scientific, and cultural activities. And it is also very important to accept that these activities only makes sense if, as Professor Collini writes in one of his books, What Are Universities For?, we agree in a key notion. Humanities are more central to a university than the natural and social sciences, even if we know how important these sciences are and how they are important to our understanding of society. Professor Stefan Collini, as I said, is the right person to open this conference. He is Professor Emeritus of Intellectual History and English Literature at Cambridge University and Fellow of the British Academy. His work reflects his major points of view in education policies and in the role of universities in a global world led by other interests and priorities. The two professors that were invited to talk with Professor Collini and to add their different ways of thinking universities are two professors of the University of Porto, Professor João Lopes dos Santos from our Faculty of Sciences and Professor Sofia Marques da Silva from the Faculty of Psychology and Educational Sciences. Professor João Lopes dos Santos' research is condensed matter physics, the subject of his PhD in the Imperial College in 1983. Now he states that more recently he addressed some of these problems, disorder and electronic structure in graphene. He was responsible for Faraday Project, a collaboration with secondary schools in the teaching of physics. Sofia Marques da Silva has 2 BAs in History and in Educational Sciences, a Master and a PhD in 28 in Educational Sciences. She works in educational policies, youth culture and behavior and gender studies. Let's listen to Professor Collini, thanking him again for having accepted our invitation. We are looking forward to discussing with him such an interesting subject.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for that introduction. I feel embarrassed by the fact that although you have invited me to speak in your country, I cannot do so in your language. And apart from the discourtesy involved in seeming to take the casual imperialism of English for granted, I fear that you may see this manifestation of monoglot insularity as an expression of the attitudes that, alas, recently led a majority of my fellow countrymen to take a disastrous decision. So, at the risk of even greater embarrassment, I am going to attempt to say the following 2 sentences. Eu me sinto muito honrado por ter sido convidado para ministrar esta palestra. Sem dúvidas, a minha pronunciação desta frase deixa bem clara a razão pela qual será para o benefício de todos que a palestra seja ministrada em inglês. I should also tell you that I will not have any visual aids, although one of my students did recently tell me that they like them because, as she put it, it gives us something to think about while you're talking. Now, this event is entitled Thinking the Future, and so it's obviously essential that this opening lecture should begin by talking very briefly about the past. All statements about the present and future of universities make assumptions about history, and many of those assumptions are often wrong or oversimplified. In later sessions at this event, as you've heard, we shall hear about such highly fashionable matters as knowledge transfer and private sector funding, international rankings and global partnerships, distance learning and social diversity, and so on. I do not underestimate the importance of these topics, but I do want us to begin by re-examining the relations between universities and society that necessarily underlie all these more specific issues. In the rush to make universities more relevant, to submit them to greater procedures of accountability, and to ensure that they contribute to economic growth, we risk unless we have a clear understanding of the relations between universities and society, we risk damaging universities and making them in the long run less valuable to society rather than more so. So if the next 3 days can be thought of as a circus, then I think my role is to be the clown before the big animals come on. And the truth is, I want to suggest that societies have always wanted their universities to fulfill diverse and not always compatible purposes, and that universities have always been partly responsive to and partly resistant to those wider social demands. But it's hard, isn't it, not to feel that just at this moment we face a particularly delicate and contested moment in this long relationship, as global finance remakes the world in its own image. Return upon capital as the shaping drive of contemporary societies, and this leads to an assertion of the primacy of contributing to economic growth as the goal, and the extension of market-driven competition as the means. Traditional universities are suspected of being, at best, irrelevant, at worst, obstructive to this agenda. And there is strong pressure for them to reshape their own activities so as better to further these economic purposes. At the same time, the extension of ideas of democratic accountability leads societies to search for mechanisms by which to test and measure the performance of universities along with all other industries and services. This results in another set of tensions, as mechanical procedures have to be devised which attempt to provide some reliable quantitative indicator of those forms of intellectual quality that perhaps can ultimately only be judged and not measured. And it's because such tensions are endemic to this relationship that my title uses the metaphor of an unhappy marriage. Now, this is a large topic. I obviously don't have time to cover all of the different elements, and these elements have differed in different societies, I'm well aware. But I would just say first that it's too simplistic, I think, to suggest that this is the straightforward outcome of the imposition of a single ideology, usually called neoliberalism. There have been several other types of social change happening that are not all attributable to one particular form of political economy, however powerful that may be. The decline of deference, the erosion of trust towards professions, the empowerment of certain kinds of populist relativism, the sheer increase of available information, these all have a complex etiology and have had their own impact on the public discussion of universities. Similarly, it's important to emphasize that some of the application of the principles of so-called new public management in public services is actually far more dirigiste than it is the expression of pure free market principles. Nonetheless, it's indisputable, I think, that in the past 2 or 3 decades, governments, notably in Britain, but also elsewhere, have increasingly treated universities as institutions whose performance can primarily be improved by subjecting them to some simulacrum of market competition and then measuring the results in various ways. Now, one feature of these changes that I think is too little noticed is the way in which the generalization of the consumer model, which is entailed by the metaphor of the market, involves an agnosticism about human ends, and hence a downgrading of reasons as opposed to preferences. Now, this promises to bypass all the difficult judgments about some activities being more worthwhile than others, and simply allows the mechanism of consumer choice in a market not just to determine outcomes, but also to confer legitimacy on them. Its strength, of course, is that no individual or group is seen to be dictating to others what they ought to want. Its weakness is that it makes it harder for public discussion to address the question of whether some purposes may be humanly more valuable than others. Instead of reasons, therefore, all we are allowed to have are opinions, which are treated and derogated as merely subjective. And between them, subjective opinions and objective data are increasingly held to exhaust the acceptable elements of public debate. As Andreas Schleicher, the man behind the controversial PISA tables of school attainment, was quoted as saying recently, "Without data, you are just another person with an opinion." And I think the fact that such a statement was allowed to pass almost without comment shows how public debate automatically tends to relegate anything which is not quantifiable to the status of mere opinion. Hence, the fetishization of metrics and benchmarks. As the American historian Jerry Muller puts it, the quest for numerical metrics of accountability is particularly attractive in cultures marked by low social trust. There's now an extensive literature on the unintended consequences and even sometimes self-defeating characteristics of many of these measures. Most famously, the work of scholars such as the American social psychologist Donald T. Campbell and the British social anthropologist Marilyn Strathern shows how, once introduced, such metric measures have a tendency to become targets in their own right, displacing the proper ends they are meant merely to record. Muller has assembled many illustrations of these truths. I would recommend his piece on this to all of you. The most chilling of the examples concerns the introduction of surgical report cards in some states in the USA in the early 1990s as a way of rating individual surgeons' efficiency and hence their salaries. This seemed to me a good example to give you while we're in a medical school. This created a pressure to operate only on categories of patient with high survival rates and to neglect the possibly needier others. As Muller dryly summarizes the outcome, more patients died, but the metrics improved. Now, the extension in the course of the 1990s and 2000s of new public management techniques to all forms of provision inevitably engendered numerous externalities in excess of the goals aimed at. One, you'll all be familiar with, is the sheer scale of machinery and cost involved in devising ways to collect evidence of efficiency. And another has been the increased availability of and reliance upon quantifiable data. This development has, in many areas of life, given rise to an enhanced emphasis upon the perceived satisfaction of those who are meant to be the beneficiaries of a given service. That is what accountability increasingly now means. But it is, I think, particularly problematic when applied to universities, where attempts to give effect to this requirement, measuring so-called perceived satisfaction of the consumer, actually involves a significant shift away from the implicit acceptance of the relevant degree of professional autonomy upon which universities have previously relied. Asking users of, say, a given rail service whether they are satisfied with the punctuality or cleanliness of the trains may yield information that can be both quantified and moderately useful. Asking users of a higher education system if they are satisfied with the quality of education they have received is likely to produce either responses that are quantifiable but of little use, or responses that may be relevant but are not quantifiable. And anyway, it's not clear, is it, that the category of users applies in such a case. Are the parents of students users? Are employers? Are those bodies who compete for young citizens' votes, or those concerned about the level of public debate or cultural provision? All of society is in some way potentially an interested party here. More fundamentally, is user satisfaction a relevant way of assessing how effectively the purposes of education have been achieved? User dissatisfaction may sometimes be an important sign that genuine education is happening. So all of this, I think, makes clear the need for a better understanding of what is distinctive about the curious institution of the university. And this is where I have to say I think a little history can be helpful. Now, although quite obviously there is no timeless essence of the university, I would suggest that there's a long history, with roots going back to at least the time of Wilhelm von Humboldt at the beginning of the 19th century, of seeing universities as partly protected spaces, in which the extension and deepening of understanding takes priority over any more immediate or instrumental purposes. Over the past 2 centuries, this idea has been powerful and in some ways resilient. It's noticeable that many institutions that were initially founded upon some other model, such as being a technical training institute or a community college, have aspired to what is perceived to be the status and freedom of a university, but that no university has ever made the journey in the reverse direction. Part of the complexity of the history of universities in most European societies lies in the interaction of 2 patterns. On the one hand, long-established universities have frequently responded to pressures to accommodate new subjects or to educate students in new ways in response to changing social and economic demands. Yet, on the other hand, institutions founded to further particular local or immediate aims have over time shown a tendency to devote themselves principally to more disinterested, long-term forms of intellectual inquiry. And as a result, critics have frequently claimed that universities need to be recalled to the socially valuable purposes of studying and teaching useful subjects rather than what are sometimes stigmatized as useless academic disciplines. But the truth is that the distinction between the useful and the useless is a rhetorical construction with no fixed or determinate content. Intellectual inquiry is in itself ungovernable. There is no predicting where thought and analysis may lead when allowed to play freely over almost any topic, as the history of science abundantly illustrates. It's sometimes said that in universities knowledge is pursued for its own sake, but that, I often think, will misdescribe the variety of purposes for which different kinds of understanding may be sought. A better way to characterize the intellectual life of universities may be to say that the drive towards understanding can never accept an arbitrary stopping point, and critique may always in principle reveal that any currently accepted stopping point is ultimately arbitrary. So human understanding, when not chained to a particular instrumental task, is restless, always pushing onwards, though not in a single or fixed or entirely knowable direction. And there's no one moment along that journey where we can say in general or in the abstract that the degree of understanding has passed from the useful to the useless. In other words, it's not the subject matter itself that determines whether something is, at any particular historical moment, classed as useful or useless. Almost any subject can fall under either description. The study of classics, now taken as the very epitome of the useless subject, was of course useful for the early modern statesman and administrator, just as theoretical physics, perhaps its utility is unquestioned, can seem rather useless to the contemporary entrepreneur. No, the important question is whether inquiry into a subject is being undertaken under what I call the sign of limitlessness. The sign of limitlessness. That's to say, not just, as with the development of all knowledge, subject to the testing of hypotheses or the revision of errors, but where the open-ended quest for understanding has primacy over any application or immediate outcome. And that, we might say, is one mark of an academic discipline. And for this reason, I think attempts to make universities into a type of institution where scholars and students study only what is useful are bound eventually to end in a kind of failure. And the attempt to make them do that can, of course, cause untold damage. I'm not proposing we should take much comfort from this thought. But all endeavors after systematic understanding of some particular subject matter are prone to generate further reflections on the premises or limitations of that understanding, and they cannot be entirely subordinated to immediate practical purposes. And of course, immediate practical purposes soon become outdated, but the forms of inquiry they provoked will then get absorbed into larger continuing inquiries. So from time to time, efforts will be made by governments or other representatives of the presumed needs of society to redirect these energies in some currently favoured practical direction. And I think it is that tension which accounts for the repeated gavotte danced between the proponents of the useful and the useless. Now, within what I'm calling the partly protected space of the university, various forms of useful preparation for life can be undertaken in a setting and manner which encourages the students to understand the contingency of any particular packet of knowledge and its interrelation with other different forms of knowledge. To do this, the teachers themselves need to be engaged in constantly going beyond the confines of the packet of knowledge they teach. I take your current drive in Portugal to ensure that university teachers are also simultaneously researchers to be a proper expression of this truth. But there is no way to prescribe in advance what will and will not be fruitful ways to connect teaching and research. Now, this dialectic between the push of immediate local pressures and the pull of long-term open-ended inquiry can be illustrated from the histories of universities in various countries, but predictably I'll take an example from the country I know best. From the mid-19th century onwards, the business leaders of the great provincial cities that had grown up in Britain as a result of the Industrial Revolution, such as Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, and so on, supported the establishment of institutions that would both prepare young men, not usually at that point young women, for a career in commerce or industry, and would develop inventions and processes that would benefit these local industries. The existing universities of Oxford and Cambridge were perceived as remote, conservative, ecclesiastical, and irrelevant to the needs of these booming industrial centres. So the new University of Birmingham, therefore, was to have a faculty of commerce, something that sounded like a contradiction in terms to the representatives of the traditional universities. And the University of Manchester, in the great capital of the cotton industry, would have a laboratory that conducted research into textile manufacturing. But over time, there was no evading the logic of what I call the Faustian pact between universities and society. An institution that wanted to develop applied science had to have teachers who could master the underlying pure science, and that is necessarily an ever-moving frontier. An institution that wanted to teach commerce was quickly drawn into appointing those who understood the principles of economics, or the development of recent and not so recent history, and so on. And there was also what we could call either civic pride or a kind of cultural snobbery, whereby those who wanted their local universities to take their places among the world's great institutions of higher learning knew that they must also have departments of mathematics and astronomy and philosophy and classics. So powerful were these other impulses that already, by the early 20th century, the most influential school of medieval historians in Britain was to be found not in one of the ancient centres of learning, but in Manchester. Now, there's much more that could be said about this example, but I'm sure you all recognise the general point. Universities respond to local needs, but they also partake of a wider inheritance, and therefore I would suggest also of an open-ended future. No one, not even a wealthy local businessman who provides a large donation, can altogether determine their character or their future, and nor can that contingent grouping of interests that constitutes the government of a country at any one time. This isn't merely an abstract point. Taking a misguidedly short-term view can have serious practical consequences. For example, the fatal conceptual error involved in the new university funding system introduced in Britain in 2012 is that it treats the fee as a payment by an individual customer to a single institutional provider for a specific service in the present. By contrast, I would argue, and many would argue, the proper basis for funding education is a form of social contract whereby each generation contributes to the education of future generations. It cannot be for a specific service because the so-called customer, in the form of the student, is not in a position to know in advance exactly what benefit they may obtain from a university education. And it cannot really be to a single institutional provider because each university is only part of the world of learning. None of what they provide for their students would exist except for the work of many people over many generations in many other institutions. So what we call a fee is not really the price of a product. It's an undertaking to contribute to the costs of the system. And in this respect, it's more like a tax, just as a tax is the tithe which citizens, as members of society, pay towards the upkeep of that society. So a university fee is more like a form of national insurance contribution, a recognition of human solidarity in facing the common perils and opportunities of life. All of this, I think, is even more emphatically the case when, as with the new system in Britain and in some other countries such as Australia, the fee is actually paid by means of a government loan, which the student then repays through an income contingent scheme over the next 30 years. And that, I think, should make even clearer that the individual student is not actually paying for the libraries and laboratories in which they work or for the training and salaries of their current teachers, since that expenditure necessarily took place long ago. They're paying towards the maintenance of these things in the future, and it's a long future. One of the most striking features of those accumulations of deepened understanding and exact knowledge that we call scholarship and science is how small a proportion of them were created by those who presently hold posts in universities. What a customer buys from an individual university is not a product or service that university has created. It's access to a complex intellectual and cultural inheritance that is only maintained and passed on in the present by the combined efforts of scholars and scientists all over the world, a population that is frequently mobile and constantly being renewed. A single, isolated university is, strictly speaking, a mirage, just as inconceivable and unsustainable as Marx long ago pointed out was the Robinson Crusoe model of economic man. Ask yourselves what proportion of the books and articles students at Porto are asked to read, or what proportion of the equipment they use and the experiments they replicate were written or created by the present members of the academic staff of this university. If we cannot say who owns an idea that was first thought 50 or 100 years ago but is now discussed in seminars and laboratories across the world, so I think we can't in any useful way say who owns the universities in which such thinking is done. Of course, we've evolved such legal instruments as copyright, patents, intellectual property rights generally, but most of what happens, and really matters, in both teaching and research, is very little constrained by such instruments. I, when teaching literature, may quite properly have to pay for the permission to reproduce a poem by a living or recently deceased poet. But everything that happens in the minds and imaginations of the readers of that poem, all the accumulated critical attention that's brought to bear on it, all the comparisons with countless other poems that are implicit in judgments of it, all the knowledge of the language or the verse forms or the history that are presupposed by any probing discussion. We do not pay a fee to the owners of the rights of these things each time we open our mouths or sit down at our keyboards. So let me conclude. Like all major social institutions, universities have developed over time by a process that includes accident as well as design, a process that has taken different forms in different periods and different places, a process we don't altogether understand even now and are not wholly in control of. Perhaps we could imagine a world in which universities never existed. We could certainly imagine a world, as the Rector was suggesting in his opening remarks, in which they are very different from how they are now. Our descendants may soon be living in such a world. But universities are what, as things have turned out, we now have. And we would surely be foolish not to recognize the immense value mankind has derived from having institutions in which pushing at the boundaries of present understanding is not a secondary or instrumental aim directed just at a particular local outcome, but is the very rationale of those institutions themselves. Such a rationale is, of course, compatible with various forms of funding and governance, as the diverse history of higher education amply attests. And I'm not suggesting that this perspective dictates one set of answers to the questions which currently concern your university and your country any more than mine. But I would suggest that such a perspective should have a chastening effect on any attempt to treat universities entirely as businesses whose profits can be accurately quantified, or to treat academics as operatives whose output can be exactly measured, or to treat students as consumers, the satisfaction of whose wants is the only relevant index of educational success. The premises of market individualism encourage us to think in terms of property rights, personal, exclusive, enforceable. Using that language which is, as always, so much more than just language, means we risk losing our capacity to articulate a better conception of the university as a collective but intangible enterprise sustained across time, both past and future, which is not the property of any one individual or group or institution or even generation. The university, understood in this way, certainly doesn't belong to the government in Lisbon or to that nebulous entity we call Portuguese society or to the good citizens of Porto. It doesn't belong either to taxpayers or to donors, necessary though their contributions may be. It doesn't belong to the professors, who sometimes think of themselves as the one indispensable element. And it doesn't belong to the students, who are periodically tempted to stake a symbolic claim by repossessing an institution they feel is rightly theirs. It doesn't belong, for all their power, to the rector and the general board, and nor does it belong to all those catering and support staff who might well say in Brechtian vein, first there is lunch, then there is studying. During this Congress, we shall hear from some people who have direct experience of wielding substantial political and institutional power, and from some people who are expert in the financial, technological, and organizational dimensions of contemporary universities. I gladly acknowledge their authority on such matters. But my role here is, I think, different. My role as a critic and historian is to remind us of the need to maintain the delicate balance between a necessary degree of autonomy and a necessary degree of responsiveness to the needs of contemporary society. That balance is not easy to maintain, and it is never stable. But the consequence of the developments I described in the first part of these remarks, when combined with a move from elite to mass systems of higher education, means that at present the greater danger is to tilt the balance too far towards short-term instrumentalism. And if we move too far towards turning universities into a large-scale apprenticeship scheme for future employment, combined with laboratories geared to industrial and commercial research exclusively, then we risk depriving future generations of students of the benefit of a university education, and we risk depriving society of the benefits of the open-ended extension of understanding. If there is any value in reflecting from time to time on the unanswerable question of who the university belongs to, perhaps it lies in this, in reminding us, amid difficult financial and political circumstances, that we are only the trustees for the present generation of a complex intellectual and cultural inheritance that we did not create and which it is not ours to allow to be destroyed. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Collini, for this so interesting lesson. And now it's the time, Professor João Lopes Santos. Yes, I think so.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know if I should thank the invitation to be in this awkward situation of having to make some comments just after hearing the lecture, but anyway, I thank the organization for this opportunity. I, for one, am very thankful for Professor Collini to recentering the discussion in this question of being trustees of a vast tradition that is centered on the limitless exploration of knowledge. I have to say that in my own experience, I could very easily answer the question, what are universities for? I was, as a 16-year-old, extremely curious about the natural world. And I was very lucky and very fortunate that there was a place that I could go to satisfy that curiosity. And so that was mostly my main drive for coming to the universities. This recentering and the fact that we should rethink some of the pressures that we're feeling makes me think very much on what has been my experience in the last years in my university. And I think we all felt some of the dangers that Professor Collini referred to in the beginning. I mean, maybe 10 years ago, if you had to judge someone for a position in university, you had to say who was the best, and that was it. And now we have to fill grids with valuations, with numbers on them. We spend much more time with our worksheets now these days because of Excel has become the preferred application because we have to produce numbers. And I should think that most of us have yielded to the pressures that these things entail and have tried to produce numbers instead of, as Professor Collini called our attention to, instead of reasons, instead of arguments, instead of fact, referring to these reasons. But I have very little to say except to say that I'm very glad that this call to attention came at this point. I myself will think harder about these situations because I've been involved too many times precisely with finding these numbers. I mean, now we have numbers to judge the quality of professors in universities. We have incredibly complicated algorithms to define whether a professor is excellent, just fair, or just sufficient, or below that. And we don't do that by the judgment of our peers, but we fill out forms with tremendously complicated situations. So we know about those things, and we also know about the distortions that these things bring. I cannot forget when I came back from my PhD, that was very, very long time ago, in the 1980s, and local production of science in my university in physics, it started only about 7-8 years before. The first paper published is dated. The first paper published in physics with physics produced in University of Porto is dated only about maybe 10, 12 years before I came back. And one of my professors was already incensed with what we call, you will allow me to say the word, what they call the prostitution of publication. That in the 1980s, okay? So I think we've come a lot further than that, and possibly, maybe it was an exaggeration at the time where our production was really very low, but we still do these maths these ways. My last comment, just to finish, is the following. I'm 60 years old. I don't know if I'm the right person to tackle on these challenges. And I feel that there are lots of people out there, outside the university system, younger people, who are really the people that can face these challenges very strongly. And so I feel that one of the problems that we have these days, and that was not referred, I think, to in the talk, because I don't know if it's a problem in Britain as well, one of the problems is that we are, generally speaking, quite old. Our universities grew a lot during a certain period. The people that entered at that time, many of them in the beginning retired, but generally speaking, we are old. After this growth period, there was a large contraction, and I believe, definitely, that there are a lot of people that I know that have come through the universities that would be in a better position than myself and maybe many of my colleagues to tackle these new generation problems that we have here. So my last comment is precisely that. Maybe we should reflect a bit that some of the problems that we have are because we've been here for too long. We've been indoctrinated by our own discussions among ourselves for too long, and we need really fresh input from people who are outside the university. So that would be my final comment to your very brilliant and very insightful, and for me, very useful and thought-provoking talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, the organization of this seminar, for inviting me in late summer. I am considering not accepting invitations like this during summer, but thank you very much for this opportunity and the opportunity also to make a few comments on this presentation of Professor Collini. As you can imagine, it's not an easy task. But it was very fruitful for me also to understand a little bit my own place in this university. I'm here since 1990 when I started studying here, and I did a small break as a secondary education teacher, but I was socialized in this university on what knowledge is and the value of knowledge. So my standpoint, to make a few comments on your work and on your presentation, is first of all that I am still willing to contribute a little bit for the construction of the university as a community. And I still think this is possible that we can do, and I think that we are working towards that. Also, I am speaking from a researcher place and from a southern country, of course struggling with a lot of, with the structure of disadvantages that we all know, that we all live. I'm not even considering here the gender issues, but also those. And we still need to be able to play a little bit the game, because we are part of the system, and the change can only be done if we are inside the system in order to know better how the things work. And I think the change, and when we are saying that there is this value, the imperative of the value, and that the value is mainly rooted in an economic growth value, means that, and if most of us are not agreeing with this, then we need to play a little bit of the game in order to try to make a change if we don't want this for us, and this pressure and this idea of excellence that is very narrow. And I am also speaking as a teacher, so I have to deal every day with students in education science, and I have to sell something, and I have to convince them that what they are learning is useful, but in a sense of usefulness that is not only rooted once more in an idea of economic growth. So, but they will be professionals, and they need to understand why they are learning subjects that they don't see because they hear the media, they know the discourse. So they know that I am trying to convince them of something, and outside the university and outside the classroom, they are influenced by several more powerful discourses and more powerful agendas that define what is valuable. And I think that it's one of the issues that I think Professor Collini is defending for a long time and discussing for a long time. So we cannot avoid the history and the legacy that we have, but we need to rework and to think about the legacy that we will give to the next generations, as my colleague previously was mentioning. But we need to think at what extent are we willing to play the game. But that's a decision. It's not only an individual decision, it's a collective decision. I am from education science, but I don't think that I am only from education science. I am from this university, and I have very good experiences in working with other faculties. And I think that it's most useful for me as an education teacher. I work with colleagues from the Faculty of Engineering, from the Faculty of Sports, from the Faculty of Medicine, and I think that this cross-fertilization and this cross-socialization, I think it's the best way for us to fight a little bit against this wave that sometimes is swallowing us all a little bit. So I think the tensions that the Professor Collini was mentioning and in his work, I think it's related with this idea of social progress that is mainly dominated by specific disciplines that produce products that are more visible and that are more understandable in the society in general. And also because they can translate that into figures and into a language that is more understandable when we are, speaking about profit or economy. And then the measuring issue came up. I think the economic metric is swallowing us all, of course. But we need to think about humanities and social sciences and how can we relate with this logic? How can we survive? How can we be preserved? Thinking also that the preservation can mean isolation. I don't want to be isolated. I would like to have the humanities and social sciences integrated in the overall knowledge production. I don't want to be preserved because we cannot disappear, but I don't want to be isolated because I am being preserved. So I want to be part of the dialogue. So I'm not sure how can we do that. I want to be part of the policy public debate. I don't want to be the something that is in the margin. It's there, but it's not part of the dialogue. And you mentioned also the knowledge consumers, which is different from the knowledge owners, and who have more power because they appropriate knowledge. Maybe who owns the university are those who are knowledge users and also owners as well. That they appropriate, circulate among networks, and then turns into what a Portuguese sociologist, Boaventura de Sousa Santos, mentioned as the idea that the scientific knowledge, the final aim is turn the scientific knowledge into common sense. It means that in our everyday life. So that's one of the things that I was thinking when you were discussing the consumers, who are the knowledge consumers as well. So, and finally, the legacy, because I'm always thinking about next generations, and some questions is how can we work the memories, because we have a legacy, and what we are doing with that legacy, it's also what will be influencing the next generations and what we can give them as well. In the end, you were discussing trying to answer your question, to whom the university belongs to, and maybe we can work. And you were saying that probably it doesn't belong to anyone in particular, or any community in particular, but maybe we need to construct a little bit the sense of belonging to something more than probably to try to figure it out to whom this institution belongs to. And the sense of belonging can be constructed in many different ways, through the communities, through networks, more at local level, at global level. And that was my contribution. Thank you.